Well, yeah, I think that there were similarities between him and I, and that we were both basically hanging out with friends, and we're part of a social circle. I mean, we both had, particular people that were probably closer to us, or our inner circles. One thing about Nelson's is that it was a lot less subtle, because back then, his camera, I don't remember how big it was, but it was certainly bigger than that. And he also had to have lights on a lot of the time when he was at a nightclub setting. So I remember not that long ago when Nelson's stuff was, added to Fales Library at NYU, Lady Miss Keir was one of the speakers from Delight, and she was saying, at first I really didn't like Nelson, because he would come into a room, lights were on, you know what I mean? And at that point, it was not chic to like, hi, you know what I mean? It was looked upon as very nerdy, to have like a camera or something. Like, who was this person? So often I think people would scatter away from him, actually, And Keir explained, like, as she got to know Nelson, she got to like him as a person, and she would, not mind being in his point of view. But Nelson's was, a big commotion sometimes, even though he could do it very adeptly. But mine was just, point and shoot. It wasn't like, a big tra-la-la. But also, I think Nelson was a little more. He was a quirky person and kind of reserved in some ways. I was a little more, I think, friendly, and integrated more into the scene than maybe he was. But I mean, he chose. That was sort of what he chose to be too. Was kind of an observer. Well, I was more of a participant. Well, that was really cool with, what happened is, I can't remember what year Paris is Burning came out. Was that like 90 or 90? Yeah. So when that came out, that really, with Willie, Ninja, et cetera, that had a great influence on the downtown scene, which RuPaul was part of, and that's the route I traveled. I was already familiar with that ball scene a little because Pat Fields had done some balls. Pat Field, the House of Field, had done some balls that had like merged downtown and uptown. But for a lot of people, like all the, voguing and all the terminology that's used in Paris is Burning was new, So, and it was very adapted by the downtown scene all of a sudden. So people were using the expressions and talking. And then I think Lady Bunny was very good about reaching out or to Willie and perhaps some other people that were in that scene to perform like at Wigstock, et cetera. Because it really was very separate worlds. I mean, there was crossover, but it was, I would say, some of it was class. A lot of the people in downtown, circle were probably like middle income, or middle-class refugees, you know what I mean? Live in the bohemian scene, myself included. And a lot of the people that were involved, of course, in the ball scene were, more inner city and, had certainly, much more street smart, you know what I mean, than a lot of us. So I think it was, but then a lot of like the voguers and stuff started dancing like at the clubs and things. And so there was sort of a merging, of these particular schools. Well, honestly, I'm not that familiar, with the 30s, for instance. I mean, I know that there's been drag personalities and, that have been popular, over the year, like Divine, perhaps, or the Warhol Stars, or, people like that managed to sort of like get some celebrity out of doing as drag personalities. But when the part of the drag explosion that I know that really started in '92 when Rue hit it big with his Supermodel single. That was building for a while in New York, and like this club scene was very, drag celebratory, and there was a really big drag culture. And so when Rue became popular, there was a lot of focus on the whole downtown drag scene, drag in general, but especially New York. And it was great in terms of like people getting attention and jobs, because the whole entertainment industry like hopped on, and so there were movies and videos and television shows, tons and tons of drag themed stuff. So it was really good. I think it was at that point though. The general public was still very naive about drag. A lot of it, there was a lot of explaining to do how drag, differed from transvestitism or transsexualism, and I think people didn't have they were fascinated by drag, but I don't think that they really, there was some hostility, and there was some, I'm trying to think, hostility and, well, I guess it was more naive behavior than anything else, but I would say it was mostly a welcoming, because I think back then it was sort of a homophobic era, and drag was a lot easier for people than accepting gay people. I mean, of course, a lot of the drag queens were gay, but it was an easier packaging, So as I mentioned before, as far as I was concerned, drag at that point was the most visible element of gay culture, because they were celebrated, and it was like Stonewall 2.0 with these drag queens like breaking down barriers, but what were the right conditions for like a drag renaissance? Some of it was just because the newness factor then. I think there's been a big drag renaissance lately, and I think most of that has to do with RuPaul's Drag Race. But then again, that's like newness too, because I don't think drag was ever featured on television so prominently. Certainly not in that exclusive, format. Well, Paige was transgender, and she was, back then, our terminology was much more crude, and or it sounds crude by today's standards. If you met someone who was trans, and no one even used the word trans or transgender. If you met someone, for instance, like Paige, you would have called her a pre-op, and with the thought that someday she would be a post-op, meaning that the operation was the big, pursuit. Not really keeping in mind that maybe some people would want to even live, otherwise, So it was, so anyways, Paige was really the first like transsexual who I really was ever friends with, or I got to know, and I think I speak for a lot of people in my circle, knew we were part of it, the big trans umbrella in a way, but we were really limited to knowing just other drag queens. So to get to know someone that was on a different, continuum was really eye-opening. And also Paige was a super fascinating person, beyond her, transgenderism. But she was also really captivating. And the reason I have a photo book, if you want to look at the book, it's just she was an extremely interesting looking person, and she was beautiful and androgynous, and I caught her in some really great photos. The ways that was the main focus, I think. And she was special too. But I think she was definitely ahead of her time, because she passed. She could have led a very conventional lifestyle if she had wanted to, but she chose her true allegiance was with the freaky set. And also, there's a short essay in the book that I mentioned. Her route was a little unusual. um, I think a lot of transsexuals come out of the drag scene. She kind of did the opposite. She sort of transitioned into like living life as a woman and then joined the drag scene. So, you know, she was comfortable enough in her own skin in some ways that she could join the drag queens. Because I think a lot of transsexuals, as they transition, often like to leave the drag behind because they don't want to be spooked, or you know what I mean, or because it was a phase in their life, you know, that on their way to like womanhood. But Paige had a, you know, kind of a opposite way of thinking, I guess. But also the main reason, also, she was a really, really dear friend of mine, and the reason I did the book was an homage, you know. So it's very heartfelt project for me. Well, as I mentioned, I think today's drag scene is very dominated by RuPaul's Drag Race, for better and for worse. You know, I mean, I think it's great that there's such a revival in drag, but to me it sort of emphasizes like a suburban drag, and so I guess that makes me a little uncomfortable because I was always used to New York dominating the scene, you know, but that's reality TV too, you know, that it allows for a lot more people to join the game. And I think that the makeup, if we're just talking specifically about makeup, the makeup techniques that are very prevalent on the RuPaul show are a lot of, you know, shading and contouring. And it's very arresting. And some of them are, you know, they're artistes, you know, they're really great. But it's a paint by number look too now, I think, that has become very common. And I honestly cannot tell a lot of the drag queens apart. I don't mean to sound like a snob, but I just feel like back in our era, there wasn't as much knowledge about that kind of thing, first of all. There wasn't YouTube tutorials. But I think a lot of the beauty was a lot more individualistic, or a lot of the looks were a lot more individualistic. And I think the role models were a little different then. We were looking to kind of emulate women, you know, or beautiful women or models, or not everybody, but you know, a lot of people were. I think now the drag queen aesthetic is to look like a drag queen, you know, like look like your sister drag queen. So it's different. I don't want to say it's worse, but I think it's a more limited sort of way of presenting oneself. Well, I actually was going out I came to New York for school, for college, from Minnesota. And then I was quite young, you know, I was 18. And then I was going out a lot. I really wasn't that interested in school. And a year and a half later, I dropped out. But I really got to know the nightlife. And that's why I know a lot of Nelson's characters and stuff, too. I wasn't doing drag like that. I didn't start doing drag until the late 80s. But I knew a lot of the drag scene, the downtown nightlife scene. And I was hanging around the Pyramid Club out of drag, and I became friends with a lot of the people that were doing drag. And that's a big reason I started doing drag myself, because you know, I really admired these people, and I really wanted to join the gang in some ways. So, and it was in me too, you know, and I just finally figured it out. But it was kind of, I think, a good way to do it, because I kind of got to know the territory first without immediately having too much on my plate, you know, doing drag all at once, trying to learn the club scene all at once, and, you know, stuff. So it was sort of fun path. Well, I think that I wasn't as, unfortunately, I probably wasn't as aware of like powdering myself, etc. You know, I probably should have been a little more focused on maintaining myself throughout the course of the night. But I was just a very interactive, fun queen. I never wore nails. I still don't. So I could always, you know, use a camera easy, or pen and paper, or whatever, you know? So it wasn't like a big deal, you know? The main problem was having a purse that was big enough to hold everything.